Hi, I'm Brian. Today, I'm going to talk about the lower class elderly. In Japan, which is experiencing a super-aging population ahead of us, the number of lower class elderly is increasing. Lower class elderly refers to elderly people who live on an income equivalent to the standard of living. It is sad that they are called lower class even after becoming elderly. When the atmosphere of classifying first class, second class, and third class people based on academic background or occupation is already prevalent. In Korea, 13% of the population is already elderly, and the speed of entering an aging society is 10 years faster than Japan. It is predicted that by 2060, more than a third of the population will be elderly. So the problem of lower class, elderly people cannot be an exception for us. Lower class elderly people exist everywhere. Elderly people who eat only one meal a day and only choose discount side dishes at the supermarket and stand at the checkout counter. Elderly people who cannot endure poverty and steal things. Elderly people who cannot think of treatment because they cannot afford hospital bills and rely on medicine from pharmacies. And elderly people who die alone because they do not have a family. There are many elderly people around us who have three main characteristics of lower class elderly people. First, they have little income. They are on welfare or slightly better. As a result, they cannot eat properly and cannot receive adequate medical care or nursing care. Second, they do not have enough savings. Without savings, they fear that they will not be able to maintain a healthy and cultural life in old age. And they will not be able to live immediately if they suddenly get an accident or illness. Unexpected expenses are common among the elderly. The third characteristic is that they have no one to rely on. The ideal life of an elderly person that everyone imagines is living with their sons and grandchildren, having everyday conversations, and relying on each other. However, for the lower class elderly, there is no one around them to have such light conversation or consult when they are in trouble. They often become socially isolated due to the poverty of relationships. When someone in the family becomes a lower class elderly person, their children can also become financially bankrupt. When the parents have a hard time, their children naturally come to their aid. As the parents get older, their medical and nursing expenses increase, and the children themselves are more likely to get sick or suffer accidents. Supporting parents who are 100% financially dependent on their children is a considerable burden on the children's generation. Considering the income of a typical household, if the younger generation goes bankrupt together due to the burden on their parents, there is a risk that the perception that old people are a nuisance and a burden will spread, and that the elderly will not be respected in society. There is still a common perception that it is good to live long, but if people who live long become a burden to society, it can lead to contempt for life and a collapse of values. In a society where the elderly are not respected like this, the younger generation will not have hope for their future or old age. In order to avoid becoming a lower-class elderly person, they will live a frugal life and will not buy cars or houses, but will live a simple and ascetic life. The phenomenon of anti-consumption among the younger generation stems from anxiety about their future. If the desire to consume among those in their 20s to 50s, who should be the most active consumers, decreases, it will be difficult to expect an economic recovery. A considerable number of young people are already making the rational choice not to get married or have children. If you think about it calmly, spending money on raising children will reduce your retirement assets. If you think it is difficult to rely on your children for your retirement like in the past, the number of young people giving up on marriage and having children will inevitably increase in the future. The problem of the lower class elderly and the instability of life in retirement are driving down the birth rate. Anyone can become a lower class elderly person. In old age, it is easier to get sick than you can imagine, and unexpected diseases such as cancer are discovered. Increasingly, medical expenses, nursing expenses, and nursing care expenses are required. There is no business in illness. Therefore, health should be a prerequisite for planning your retirement. Also, even if you were healthy until your 60s or 70s, you should prepare for your 70s or 80s as your life expectancy increases. As old age becomes longer, not only expensive medical expenses, but also living expenses increase even more. No matter how well you plan your life in old age, as your life expectancy increases, the probability of getting sick or having an accident increases significantly. The scariest thing is dementia. If you get dementia, your retirement plan itself can be ruined. Recently, not only can you not expect your children to take care of you, but in some cases, your children are also the cause of your downsizing. This is because your children are becoming working poor, reclusive loners, and relying on their parents. In particular, irregular workers are not receiving enough bonuses and welfare benefits, which is causing poverty among the youth. There are also increasing cases where people have no choice but to live with their parents, and their parents pay for their living expenses with their savings or pensions. The increase in the number of young people who cannot be independent without relying on their parents is another cause of the increase in the number of downsizing elderly people. The movie, Plan 75, released in Japan recently, introduces a policy in which the government actively supports the death of elderly people over 75 years old, in order to reduce the financial burden on the youth. Although it is just a scene from a movie, it makes me think about whether the value of a person's life can be judged by whether or not it is helpful to society. It is necessary to strengthen the social safety net to solve the problem of the elderly in the lower class. But it can never be solved with measures for the elderly alone. If our society does not seriously address employment policies for the youth and improving the working conditions of irregular workers, it could create elderly people who are at risk of becoming elderly in the lower class in the future. Everyone gets old and becomes elderly. It is not desirable to think of the problem of the elderly in the lower class as an individual responsibility. We need to start by having the awareness to think of the elderly in the lower class as our own problem. It is the country and the social structure that creates the elderly in the lower class. It is not just the family's problem. There is no future for the country unless we seriously confront the poverty of the elderly in the lower class.